The fastest way to discover who someone really is isn't by watching how they treat the powerful. It's by watching how they treat the person serving their dinner. I learned that lesson on a rainy Friday night beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected more money than I had seen in my entire life. My name is Emily Carter. I was 25 years old, and I spent every evening balancing silver trays through crowded dining rooms while pretending my feet didn't ache after 12-hour shifts. The Romano Foundation's annual charity gala was supposed to be my biggest night of the month. The tips from wealthy donors usually covered my mother's medication, my rent, and whatever groceries I could squeeze into what remained of my paycheck. I tied my apron one last time, adjusted the small black name tag clipped neatly over my uniform, and reminded myself to smile no matter what happened. Smiles were free, and sometimes they were the only thing I had left to give. The ballroom glittered with polished marble, fresh white roses, and enough designer suits to make the place feel more like a museum than a hotel. Conversations floated through the air beside soft piano music, while expensive perfume mixed with the scent of fresh coffee and steak. Everyone looked like they belonged there except me. I belonged behind the trays, invisible until someone wanted another drink. Table 14, my manager whispered. VIP guests. Don't make mistakes. I nodded even though my hands already felt cold. I picked up a tray holding crystal glasses and made my way across the room, weaving carefully between elegant gowns and polished dress shoes. Then someone stepped backward without looking. My shoulder brushed another server. The tray shifted. Time slowed. One glass tipped just enough for a splash of red wine to land across the sleeve of an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. Silence arrived before I could even breathe. I looked up into a pair of icy blue eyes that seemed completely incapable of mercy. The man standing before me didn't raise his voice. Somehow that made everything worse. He glanced at the stain, then back at me as though I had personally ruined his evening. "Do they not teach basic coordination anymore?" he asked calmly. The guests nearby stopped talking. I felt dozens of eyes settle on me. Heat climbed into my face. "I'm so sorry, sir," I whispered. "It was an accident. I'll pay for the cleaning." A few quiet laughs drifted through the crowd. His expression never changed. "With what?" he replied. "A week's worth of tips." The words were soft, almost conversational, but they landed harder than any shout could have. My fingers tightened around the empty tray. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the marble floor to open beneath my shoes and swallow me whole. Instead, I lowered my eyes because that was what waitresses did when powerful people decided they were no longer human. "I apologize," I said again, keeping my voice steady even as my throat tightened. "It won't happen again." He accepted a clean napkin from one of his associates without looking away from me. "See that it doesn't." Then he turned slightly, dismissing me with the effortless confidence of someone who had never been ignored a single day in his life. Around us, conversations slowly returned, glasses clinked again, and the music continued as though nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed. I stepped backward, forcing my breathing to stay even, reminding myself that my mother needed her medicine more than I needed my pride. I took one more careful step before hearing someone quietly say, "Boss, your car is ready." He nodded without answering. Then, just as he started toward the exit, his gaze drifted across the room one final time and stopped on the small black name tag resting over my heart. His footsteps stopped. I did not see it happen at first because I was staring at the polished marble floor, trying to convince myself that the burning in my face would disappear before my next table needed service. Then the room became strangely quiet again. Not the comfortable silence of elegant people enjoying expensive dinners, but the kind that makes every instinct tell you something has shifted. I looked up just enough to see Damian Romano standing only a few feet away, no longer walking toward the exit. His attention was not on the stain across his sleeve anymore. It was fixed on the small black name tag pinned above my heart. Emily Carter. His eyes narrowed as if he had seen a ghost hiding behind ordinary plastic. For several long seconds, he said absolutely nothing. One of the men beside him cleared his throat softly. "Sir." Damien did not answer. Instead, he took one slow step closer. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than the piano playing across the ballroom. His expression had changed. The cold confidence was still there, but something else had appeared beneath it. Confusion, recognition, maybe even disbelief. "What is your last name?" he asked quietly. The question caught me completely off guard. "Carter," I answered without thinking. Emily Carter. He stared at me as though repeating the name silently inside his mind. How long have you worked here? Almost 2 years. Where are you from? I hesitated. The questions felt strangely personal after everything that had just happened. Brooklyn, I replied. My mother and I have always lived there. He nodded once, almost absent-mindedly, before looking toward one of the men standing beside him. Cancel the car, he said. I need 20 minutes. The associate looked surprised but immediately stepped away, speaking quietly into an earpiece. Damien turned back toward me. His voice remained calm, yet it no longer carried the sharp edge that had humiliated me only moments earlier. Who is your father? My throat tightened. That question always did something to me. He passed away when I was 6. His jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. His name? Michael Carter. I watched every trace of color leave his face. It happened so quickly that I wondered if I had imagined it. His eyes drifted somewhere beyond the ballroom, beyond the chandeliers and polished tables, as though he had suddenly stepped into a memory that refused to let him go. He whispered the name once. Michael. It sounded less like a question and more like someone opening a door they had kept locked for years. Before I could ask what was happening, my manager rushed toward us wearing the nervous smile managers always wore around wealthy donors. Miss Carter, he said through gritted teeth. Table 9 has been waiting. I immediately nodded. I am sorry. I started to leave, but Damien spoke again. One moment. His voice was still steady, yet every person nearby froze as if they had received an order without hearing one. Even my manager stopped moving. Damien reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. For one terrifying second I thought he was going to hand me money. My pride had already taken enough damage for one evening. Instead, he removed a simple silver business card with only his name embossed across the front. He looked at it for a moment before sliding it back into his pocket. Never mind, he murmured almost to himself. Not yet. He stepped aside, giving me room to pass. It was the first respectful gesture he had shown me all night, and somehow it unsettled me more than the humiliation had. As I walked toward table 9 carrying a fresh tray of sparkling water, I could still feel his eyes following me across the ballroom. I told myself it was because powerful men liked controlling every room they entered. I told myself it had nothing to do with me. But I did not see Damien Romano quietly pull out his phone after I disappeared into the crowd. I did not hear the first words he spoke into it. Find everything you can about Michael Carter, he said. Tonight. The gala finally ended a little after 11. But the weight sitting on my chest followed me long after the last champagne glass had been collected. I changed out of my uniform in the tiny employee locker room, folded my apron with the same care I always did, and clipped my name tag into the front pocket of my canvas backpack. It was old and scratched around the edges, but I had worn it every shift for almost 2 years. As I stepped outside, cool autumn air brushed against my face, carrying the scent of rain and wet pavement through downtown Manhattan. My bus stop was 4 blocks away, and I walked the familiar route beneath glowing streetlights while replaying the evening over and over inside my head. I should have watched where I was going. I should have protected the tray better. I should not have let his words affect me so deeply. Yet no matter how many times I tried to blame myself, I kept hearing the quiet laughter that followed his remark. By the time I reached my apartment in Brooklyn, midnight had already come and gone. The building looked exactly as it always did. Old brick walls, flickering hallway lights, and a mailbox that never seemed to close completely. Inside apartment 3B, the television was playing softly in the living room. My mother had fallen asleep in her favorite chair with a blanket across her knees and a book resting upside down on her lap. I smiled despite everything. She always tried to stay awake until I came home. I gently covered her shoulders before placing the paper bag of leftover dinner on the kitchen counter. Tomorrow's lunch was officially taken care of. After checking that she had taken her evening medication, I slipped quietly into my bedroom. It was barely large enough for a twin bed, a second-hand desk, and a bookshelf filled with nursing textbooks I still hoped to finish studying one day. I opened my notebook and reviewed my monthly budget. Rent was due in 9 days. My mother's prescriptions would refill next week. The numbers refused to work no matter how many times I added them. I sighed, closed the notebook, and whispered to myself, one more double shift. Across the city, however, sleep seemed impossible for someone else. Damien Romano stood alone inside a quiet office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Rain traced slow lines across the glass while a single desk lamp illuminated several folders spread neatly before him. One of his most trusted investigators entered without making unnecessary noise and placed a thin file on the desk. "Everything we found in the last 2 hours," he said. Damien opened it immediately. The first page contained my employee records. The second listed my address, my work history, and my enrollment in a community college nursing program that I had paused after my mother's illness became worse. Another page showed medical bills that had quietly accumulated over the past 3 years. There was no debt from reckless spending, no luxury purchases, no hidden accounts. Only hospital invoices, pharmacy receipts, and overtime pay. Damien continued turning pages until he reached an old newspaper clipping. A faded photograph showed a smiling man wearing a construction helmet. The headline read, "Local foreman remembered for extraordinary courage during Midtown building collapse." Damien did not blink. His fingers remained perfectly still on the edge of the paper. The investigator spoke carefully. "Michael Carter passed away shortly after helping several workers escape. Your father attended the memorial service." Damien slowly looked up. "Why was I never told his family disappeared?" The investigator hesitated. "Your father searched for them for several years. The records suggest they moved before anyone could locate them." Damien lowered his eyes to the photograph again. He recognized the face immediately, not because he had met the man, but because that same picture had once sat inside his late father's private study beside a handwritten note that simply read, "I owe this man more than I can ever repay." Damien leaned back in complete silence. For the first time in years, the humiliation of a stranger echoed louder than every business victory he had ever achieved. He closed the file gently, stared into the rain beyond the window, and quietly gave only one instruction. "Tomorrow morning, I am going to that restaurant. No cameras. No publicity. I need to see Emily Carter again." The next morning began like every other one in my life. My alarm rang at 6:30. The coffee tasted weaker than I wanted it to, and I left the apartment before sunrise so my mother would not worry about how tired I looked. The subway was crowded with people carrying briefcases, backpacks, and paper cups that promised energy none of us really had. By the time I reached the restaurant, I had already convinced myself that the previous night was over. Powerful people embarrassed ordinary people every day. They forgot us before dessert arrived. There was no reason to believe I had occupied even a passing thought in Damien Romano's mind after he left the gala. I tied my apron, clipped my name tag back into place, and started preparing the dining room for lunch service. The polished silverware reflected the morning light spilling through the front windows, while soft jazz played through hidden speakers. My manager hurried past carrying reservation folders. "Busy day," he said. "Corporate lunch at noon. Stay sharp." I smiled and nodded. Staying sharp was easier than staying hopeful. Around 11:30, the front door opened. I was polishing water glasses behind the hostess stand when an unfamiliar silence spread through the restaurant. Conversations did not stop because the dining room was still nearly empty. Instead, the staff stopped moving. I looked up and immediately recognized the charcoal overcoat, the confident posture, and those unmistakable blue eyes. Damien Romano had returned. He was alone. No associates. No security surrounding him. Just one man quietly walking toward a corner table by the window. My pulse stumbled for reasons I could not explain. My manager rushed over with his brightest professional smile. "Mr. Romano, what an honor. We can prepare our private dining room if you would prefer." Damien glanced around the restaurant once before answering. "No, this table is fine." His voice remained calm, but it carried the same effortless authority as before. Then he added something none of us expected. "I would like Miss Carter to be my server." My manager blinked twice. "Of course." He looked toward me. "Emily." Every pair of eyes in the restaurant suddenly turned in my direction. I walked over carrying a menu, reminding myself to breathe normally. "Good afternoon," I said politely. "May I bring you some coffee while you decide?" He looked at me for a long moment before quietly saying, "Black." "Thank you." There was no sarcasm, no cold smile, no trace of the man who had humiliated me less than 12 hours earlier. I brought his coffee, placed it gently on the table, and prepared to step away. "Emily." I paused. Hearing my name spoken so carefully sounded strangely unfamiliar after the way he had dismissed me the night before. "Yes, sir." His eyes settled briefly on my name tag again. How is your mother feeling? The question stole every prepared thought from my mind. I stared at him in complete confusion. My mother? He seemed to realize what he had revealed. I apologize. I should not have asked, but it was already too late. How do you know about my mother? I asked quietly. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup, studying the steam rising between us. Because I spent most of last night learning about the family I should have known years ago. My heartbeat quickened. I do not understand. He looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time since we had met, I saw something unexpected there. It was not power. It was not confidence. It looked remarkably like regret. Neither do you, he said softly. But I intend to change that, if you will allow me the chance. For several seconds, I simply stood there holding an empty coffee pot, while the rest of the restaurant continued moving around us. Plates arrived from the kitchen. Customers laughed over business meetings. Someone dropped a fork across the room. Ordinary life continued, yet it felt as though the world had narrowed until only Damien and I remained inside it. I searched his face for any sign that this was another cruel joke, but I found nothing except quiet sincerity. I have tables waiting, I finally said, my voice softer than I intended. Of course, he replied, immediately moving his chair back a few inches. I will not interfere with your work. I nodded and walked away, but concentrating became almost impossible. Every order I wrote down blurred together. Every time I passed his table, I could feel his attention without ever seeing him look directly at me. It was not the uncomfortable feeling of being judged anymore. It was something heavier, like someone carrying a burden they no longer knew how to hide. Nearly an hour later, the lunch rush slowed. My manager gave me 5 minutes to catch my breath before the afternoon reservations arrived. As I reached for a glass of water behind the service station, Damien quietly approached instead of asking me to return to his table. He stopped several feet away, careful not to invade my space. May I explain something? He asked. I folded my arms. You may try. He accepted the answer with a small nod. Your father worked with mine more than 20 years ago. The words immediately caught my attention. My father rarely spoke about his construction jobs before he passed away. Most of what I knew came from faded photographs and stories my mother could barely finish without becoming emotional. My father always said there was one man he trusted with his life, Damien continued. That man was Michael Carter. I stared at him, unsure whether to believe any of it. If that is true, I replied carefully, why have I never heard your family name before? A shadow crossed his expression. Because my father spent years searching for you after yours passed away. By the time he found a lead, your mother had moved. Records disappeared. Addresses changed. He never forgave himself for losing contact. I looked down at the floor, trying to fit his words into memories that never seemed complete. My mother had moved us more than once after Dad died, always saying we needed a fresh start. I had never questioned it. Children accepted whatever adults called normal. Damien reached inside his coat pocket. Slowly, so I would not misunderstand the gesture, he removed an old photograph protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. He placed it gently on the service counter without touching my hands. I picked it up. The edges had faded with age, but the faces remained unmistakable. My father stood smiling beside another man I recognized from newspaper articles after his passing. Damien's late father. They looked less like business partners and more like brothers. My throat tightened. I had never seen that photograph before. On the back, written in careful blue ink, were only 7 words. Friends longer than fortune will ever measure. I traced the handwriting with my thumb before looking back at Damien. Where did you get this? It was in my father's private study, he answered. He kept it until the day he died. Neither of us spoke for several long moments. Finally, I handed the photograph back. Even if everything you said is true, I whispered, it does not erase what happened last night. His eyes lowered immediately. I know. You embarrassed me in front of an entire ballroom. I know. You judged me before you even knew my name. He closed his eyes briefly, as though each sentence confirmed what he had already been telling himself since the gala. When he looked at me again, there was no defense in his voice. There is no excuse for what I did, Emily. I cannot change those few minutes. I can only spend whatever time comes next trying to deserve your forgiveness, even if I never receive it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange blur. Damien finished his coffee, thanked me quietly, and left enough cash to cover the bill without adding the extravagant tip everyone expected from someone with his wealth. It was almost as though he understood that leaving a fortune on the table would feel less like kindness and more like another reminder of the distance between our worlds. I watched him walk through the front door without looking back, and only then did I realize I had been holding my breath. My manager appeared beside me almost immediately. "Emily," he whispered, "what exactly was that about?" I forced a small smile. "I wish I knew." He looked unconvinced but accepted the answer because another group of customers had just arrived. By the end of my shift, my feet ached, my shoulders felt heavy, and my mind was even more exhausted than my body. As I walked toward the subway station, I kept replaying everything Damien had said. The photograph, my father, the apology. None of it fit the man I had met the night before. People did not change that quickly. At least, that was what I had always believed. 2 days passed without another visit. I almost convinced myself that our strange conversation had been the end of it. Then Friday evening arrived, bringing another busy dinner service. Every table was full, conversations filled the room, and the kitchen worked at a pace that left no time for distractions. I balanced a tray of fresh entrees through the crowded dining room when one of our regular customers, a wealthy real estate developer named Charles Whitmore, waved me toward his table. He was known for expecting perfect service and reminding everyone how important he believed he was. "Miss Carter," he said with a broad smile that never quite reached his eyes, "I have been waiting nearly 10 minutes for another iced tea." "I am sorry for the delay," I replied politely. "I will bring it right away." As I turned to leave, he spoke loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Young people today always have excuses. Perhaps if you smiled more and hurried a little faster, this place would deserve its prices." A few guests looked away awkwardly while others pretended not to notice. I felt the familiar sting of embarrassment rising again, but I reminded myself why I worked there. My mother needed stability more than I needed the last word. "I will have your drink in just a moment," I answered calmly. Before I could take another step, another voice entered the conversation. Or perhaps, the voice said evenly, "She deserves the same patience you would expect if your positions were reversed." The restaurant became noticeably quieter. I turned and saw Damian Romano standing near the entrance, still wearing his overcoat from outside. He had apparently arrived only seconds earlier, yet somehow he had witnessed enough to understand exactly what was happening. Charles Whitmore laughed awkwardly. "I was only making conversation." Damian walked closer, neither hurried nor aggressive, simply composed. Conversation usually includes respect. His tone never rose above an ordinary speaking voice, but every word seemed to settle over the room with unmistakable weight. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I did not intend any offense. Damien looked briefly toward me before returning his attention to the table. "Intent matters," he said quietly. "So do results." Then he turned toward me completely. "Miss Carter, whenever you are ready, I would appreciate a table." It was the first time anyone in that restaurant had ever addressed me with such deliberate courtesy. I nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. As I led him toward a quiet table by the window, I realized something even more surprising than his apology. Damian Romano was no longer trying to impress me with his influence. He was trying to become the kind of man my father would have respected. After seating Damian by the window, I placed a menu in front of him even though I suspected he had not come for the food. The late afternoon sun filtered through the glass, casting long golden reflections across the polished table while the quiet conversations around us slowly returned to normal. It amazed me how quickly people accepted unexpected moments and continued with their own lives. "I wish my own thoughts worked that way. May I bring you the usual?" I asked. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I have only been here once before." I realized he was right and felt embarrassed by my assumption. "Black coffee," he added gently. "That part has not changed." I nodded and walked toward the service station. When I returned with the steaming cup a minute later, he waited until I had placed it carefully on the table before speaking again. "Thank you, Emily." Hearing my name still sounded different coming from him. Not because of the words themselves, but because they carried genuine respect instead of obligation. Before I could excuse myself, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully placed a small leather notebook on the table between us. "You do not have to read this now," he said quietly, "but I believe it belongs to your family." I looked down at the worn brown cover. The leather had softened with age, its edges faded from years of careful handling. "What is it?" I asked. "My father's journal." I looked back at him in confusion. "Why would your father's journal belong to me?" He rested one hand beside the notebook without opening it. "Because almost every page from one particular year mentions your father." My heart skipped. Slowly I opened the cover. The handwriting inside was elegant and deliberate, written with blue fountain pen ink that had slightly faded over time. I turned several pages until a folded photograph slipped gently onto the table. It was another picture of our fathers, this time standing beside a steel framework beneath a bright summer sky. Both men were laughing. They looked younger than I had ever imagined them. Beneath the photograph, a short sentence had been written in careful script. "If Michael is leading the crew today, I know everyone will make it home safely." I swallowed hard. For years I had struggled to remember my father's voice. Yet here was another man describing him with a warmth that made him feel alive again. Damien remained silent while I continued reading. Another page described shared lunches, birthday celebrations, and quiet conversations after long construction shifts. There was nothing dramatic, just the ordinary moments that build lifelong friendships. Finally, I closed the journal and looked up. My mother never told me any of this. Damien nodded slowly. My father believed she wanted privacy after losing him. He respected that choice even though it broke his heart. I traced my fingertips lightly across the notebook cover before sliding it back toward him. "You should keep it." He gently pushed it back to me. "No." His voice carried quiet certainty. "He would have wanted you to have it." Emotion tightened my throat, but another question refused to leave my mind. "If your father cared so much about mine, why did you never know who I was?" Damien looked out the window for several long seconds before answering. "Because I was too young to understand what happened, and when I grew older, I became consumed by building the business my father left behind. I inherited his success, but not enough of his wisdom." His honesty left no room for excuses. It simply existed between us, plain and unprotected. I studied the man sitting across from me and realized he was not asking me to forget what had happened at the gala. He was asking for the opportunity to become someone different from the man who had walked into that ballroom. For the first time since we met, I did not see Damien Romano as the powerful stranger who had humiliated a waitress. I saw a son trying to repair a promise his father had never lived long enough to fulfill. The journal came home with me that evening, tucked carefully inside my backpack beside my nursing textbooks. I carried it the entire subway ride as though it were something fragile enough to disappear if I looked away for too long. When I opened the apartment door, my mother was standing in the kitchen making tea. She smiled the way she always did when I came home safely, but the moment her eyes fell on the worn leather cover in my hands, her expression changed completely. The color faded from her face. She slowly placed the kettle back on the stove without saying a word. "Mom," I asked gently, "do you recognize this?" She stared at the journal for several long seconds before whispering, "I prayed I would never see that again." I set it carefully on the kitchen table. It belonged to the Romano family. She closed her eyes. "Then Damien found you." It was not a question. My heart began to race. "You knew this would happen?" She pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, as though years of memories had suddenly become too heavy to carry standing up. I sat across from her, waiting quietly. Finally, she opened the journal with trembling hands and smiled sadly at one of the photographs. "Your father loved Anthony Romano like a brother," she said. "They met on a construction site before either of them had much money. They trusted each other with everything." I listened without interrupting. "When your father passed away," she continued, "Anthony tried to help us more than once. He offered financial support. He wanted to make sure you could go to school without worrying about bills. He even offered to help us buy a small home." I looked at her in surprise. "Why did you refuse?" Tears gathered in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "Because your father spent his entire life teaching me that kindness should never become a debt. Anthony wanted to help because he loved his friend. I wanted to honor your father's pride. So I thanked him, and we left before he could insist." Suddenly, so many missing pieces fit together. The moves, the fresh starts, the years of quiet struggle. "You never told me," I whispered. She reached across the table and gently held my hand. "Because I wanted you to build your own life, not one shaped by someone else's gratitude." I lowered my eyes to the journal. "Damien says he wants to make things right." My mother smiled softly. "That sounds like Anthony's son." I hesitated before asking the question that had stayed with me since the gala. Do you think I should forgive him? She remained silent for a moment before answering. Forgiveness is never owed, Emily. It is a gift. Give it only if your heart is ready, never because someone powerful asks for it. The following afternoon, I returned to work carrying those words with me. The restaurant looked exactly as it always had, but I noticed something waiting near the hostess stand before my shift even began. It was a small cardboard box wrapped with a simple blue ribbon. There was no expensive logo, no elaborate presentation, only a handwritten note resting on top. It read, "For your nursing classes. No expectations. No conditions. Damien." Curious, I opened the box. Inside were brand new editions of every nursing textbook I had marked as too expensive to purchase the previous semester. I knew immediately how much they must have cost. I also knew exactly what my mother would say. Before my shift ended, I called the number printed on Damien's business card. When he answered, I spoke before he could. "Thank you for thinking of me," I said quietly. "But I cannot accept these." There was a brief silence before he replied with complete understanding. "I thought you might say that. Respect cannot be bought," I continued gently. "Not even with kindness." His answer came without disappointment or argument. "Then I will have to earn it the slow way." Almost a year passed before I fully understood what Damien had meant. He never tried to surprise me with expensive gifts again. He never called in favors, never asked my manager for special treatment, and never appeared expecting forgiveness simply because he had apologized. Instead, he did something much more difficult. He became consistent. Some afternoons, he stopped by for a cup of black coffee, always sitting at the same table by the window. Sometimes he stayed 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. We talked about my nursing classes after I finally returned to school, about my mother's improving health, about the books he had started reading because his father had once recommended them, but he had never made the time. Other days we barely spoke at all. He would thank me for the coffee, pay the bill, and quietly leave. Somewhere along the way, the fear I had felt whenever I saw him disappeared. It was replaced by something much steadier. Trust does not arrive all at once. It grows in ordinary moments that almost nobody notices. One rainy Tuesday evening, my manager called everyone together before opening for dinner. He looked unusually emotional. "Congratulations, Emily," he announced with a smile. "Starting next Monday, you will officially become our new dining room manager." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. Then the entire staff applauded. I covered my mouth with both hands, unable to believe what I had just heard. The promotion came with better hours, health insurance, and enough of a salary increase that I would no longer need a second weekend job to keep our apartment. I called my mother during my break, and I could hear her crying with happiness before I even finished telling her the news. When I returned to the dining room, I noticed Damien sitting quietly at his usual table. Somehow he had already heard. As I approached, he stood instead of remaining seated. "Congratulations, Miss Carter," he said warmly. Not Emily. Not Waitress. Miss Carter. The respect in those two words meant more than every expensive gift he had ever considered giving me. "Thank you," I replied with a smile that came naturally this time. "I earned this one." He nodded immediately. "I know you did." We shared a comfortable silence before I finally asked the question that had lived quietly inside my heart for months. "Why did you keep coming back?" He looked toward the window where soft rain blurred the city lights into shimmering reflections. "Because my father taught me that real honor is not measured by how quickly someone forgives you. It is measured by whether you become worthy of forgiveness even if it never comes." I felt my eyes sting with unexpected tears. "I forgave you a long time ago," I admitted. "Not because you are powerful, not because of our fathers, because every time you walked through that door after the gala, you chose to become a better man than the one who walked into that ballroom." His shoulders relaxed in a way I had never seen before, as though he had finally laid down a burden he had been carrying for years. Before leaving, he placed a small framed photograph on the table. It was the same picture of our fathers laughing together beneath the unfinished steel beams, but this time it had been professionally restored. On the back was a single handwritten sentence. "They built buildings together. Maybe we can build something better." I still keep that photograph in my office today beside my nursing diploma and my father's old work gloves. Every morning before the restaurant opens, I glance at all three and remember the lesson that changed my life. Some people have enough money to buy almost anything they want, but respect cannot be purchased, forgiveness cannot be demanded, and character cannot be inherited. They must all be earned, one quiet choice at a time.